Good evening, everyone. The JSC Press is delighted to be hosting this webinar today. The webinar is titled Tools of Destabilisation, Mainstream Media Propaganda, with the participation of KERRY McNAMARA, Community College Professor, Patrick HENNINGSEN, a journalist and radio host, VANASSA, BEELEY, an independent journalist, and CAMILA ESCALANTE, also a journalist and co-founder of Kawsachun News. The webinar will focus on the narratives of mainstream media propaganda, its biases and tendencies. The themes will include several topics, the most important of which are the media's role in destabilizing security and overall stability, its influence on local and global public opinion, its handling of the region's issues, bias in relation to covering elections taking place in the region, media content directed against the countries of the region, and media interference in internal affairs. JSC Press upholds this webinar in accordance to its commitment to freedom of expression, press and media freedom, with an affirmation of the right to seek, impart and disseminate information as enshrined in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/JSCPress. JSC Press is a platform for independent journalists. First, I would like to introduce our first guest with us, our first contributor. We have Patrick HENNINGSEN. He's a journalist, radio host, TV broadcaster, and a co-founder of founder and editor of 21st Century Wire. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me, Hasan, and it's a pleasure to also share the panel with all of these great independent journalists as well from around the world. And just to start off, I know the theme of this webinar is propaganda in the context of destabilization. So what I'm going to do in my opening remarks really is just kind of set a baseline, put things into perspective, a starting point, if you will, talking about what is propaganda and sort of defining it, and then showing the relationship between the corporate media, for instance, and our governments as well. But firstly, I'll just say that the subject of propaganda is ubiquitous in the world right now. It's everywhere. We see propaganda all day, every day, and half the time we don't even realize we're looking at it, whether that's corporate propaganda or whether that is government propaganda as well. And certainly governments are looking at this through a geopolitical lens as well. The United States will say, we don't do propaganda, that's something the Russians do. And vice versa, other countries will be accusing others of using propaganda. So there's many different ways we can use this term, and also it depends what perspective you're speaking from. But what we're going to try to do today, I think, is to give an objective analysis of what the global geopolitical playing field was. And the important thing is everyone does propaganda. However, we're talking about how it relates to power. Certain countries, certain coalitions of countries have greater capability, greater power to exert brute force with propaganda in order to mold and create consensus for various foreign policies and various actions or humanitarian interventions and things like this. So we'll try to give it some perspective, and certainly we'll start with the relationship between Western governments and the transnational corporate media. We're talking about the big brands, the Murdoch press, the CNNs of the world, the BBC, and also the major news agencies, Reuters, Associated Press, for instance. That's the beginning point, that's the starting point for so much information. And I can speak certainly about the United States in that respect. Even if you go back to the Civil War in the United States, the North versus the South, there was a war going on between the government and the media because there was propaganda going on both sides, and President Lincoln shut down no less than 50 media outlets by executive order, something that if you did that today or in the last century, people would say that's outrageous, that's fascist, but yet this happened in the United States. So fast forward to today, now you have an international corporate media network with brands like the BBC, brands like CNN, Sky, the Murdoch press. Then the print publications are also doing broadcast video now as well. The New York Times playing a pivotal role in consensus building around important issues. Syria is a good example. The chemical weapons attack in Douma. These newspapers have whole departments doing forensic analysis of various things in order to, and that feeds into other mainstream media outlets like CNN or Der Spiegel in Germany. And so what we're really talking about here is consensus building. And so if we have those visuals available, I don't know if the studio can do this, but if you put up slide 3, I'm not sure if they have that or not, but we have a slide that I would like to use as an exhibit just to kind of frame it. So when we talk about propaganda, this is kind of a baseline book here. This is by Noam Chomsky in the United States and Edward Herman, and Manufacturing Consent. So this idea of manufacturing consensus or consent, this is the whole object of propaganda. So what tools do you have in your toolbox in order to make this happen? And really, we can extend this now into a bigger picture. And we're talking about the United States. A lot of people would say, yes, the US has a powerful propaganda machine, but now it's gone beyond that. And so if we look at, I'll give you an example, slide 7. There is something which was formulated in 2018 at the G7, the Group of 7 meeting. It's called the Rapid Response Mechanism. And the Rapid Response Mechanism was an agreement by all G7 nations that the leaders will take exactly the same position publicly regarding any major foreign policy event or crisis. In other words, all propaganda is streamlined with the Rapid Response Mechanism. This is now public. So, give you an example, the Skripal attacks, the Novichok attacks, the recent election in Belarus, all the G7 countries have an identical position on that because of this. The Douma alleged chemical weapons attack in Syria, the Yemeni missile attacks as well. How are they framing that? Is this Iranian-backed? If so, all the G7 countries have to take an identical position on that as well. So that's a good example that we're talking about something that extends beyond even the United States. So I'll show you a map of this destabilization and propaganda, how this looks globally. If you look at slide 4, this will give you some context as to where we're at in terms of globally. Now, the United States is obviously the biggest in terms of its media power, in terms of its corporate influence, and so it needs to propagandize the NATO countries and the G7 countries. Why? They need to manufacture that consent that Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman are talking about. So there you can see there's the NATO countries and the G7. You've got the major countries. I put Britain, France, Canada there, the European Union, Australia, for instance. They need to be propagandized as well, because those governments are going to be asking their people for consent for various foreign policies. And if you go back to that visual as well, just to extend on that, if we go back to that slide, now the United States is also using civil society media, Radio Free Europe, for instance. George Soros has a number of media outlets that are being used in this way. And then the European countries are also funding. In Syria is a good example, again, civil society, the White Helmets, the Aleppo Media Center, funded by the French government, and also Syria Deeply. There's all these different media outlets that are used to really kind of get consent amongst the Western English language media audiences, fed back through mainstream media here. But also, most importantly, the US has to propagandize its own citizens in order to manufacture that consent as well. So it's going in multiple directions. The targets here, if you look at Syria, Iraq, Iran, Venezuela, Ukraine as examples, those are the target nations. So you could extend this as well. You propagandize within Syria, within opposition factions, trying to destabilize and break up a country from within, and some of that happens externally. A good example, if you look at the Middle East, is the amount of satellite TV channels there on the Hotbird satellite networks, for instance. That's being beamed directly into various places. In Syria is a good example, again, from a lot of Saudi Arabian channels that are espousing a specific pro-rebel or pro-al-Nusra, for instance. So they're hitting the population directly via satellite channels. And so there could be any kind of propaganda, fake news, exaggerations, reportings, rumors could be then packaged as news, like our mainstream media do, but it's also being done in the Arab language channels as well. I mean, so if you look at some of these places, Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Iran, so there's a lot of influences coming via different media networks. So the other thing that we want to comment on as well is you have to look at this in a context of information warfare. So if we look at slide 6, I'll tell you this just happened this morning. The U.S. federal government freezed a number of web domains, including Press TV, which is a very well-known brand for global English language media. It's been going for over a decade, I think since 2007 or 2006, I believe. So they've seized that title plus a number of others. Basically, that's another extension. This is beyond censorship. It's beyond deplatforming. It is literally denying the ability for state media to communicate to a global audience. So you could also view this as a prelude to military action. If a country is going to war against a country, that's a standard information warfare, is you cut off any ability for the country to broadcast from on the ground to see what's going on, so people can't get that viewpoint, that vantage point. So in that case, what dominates the airwaves in terms of propaganda will be coming from CNN or the BBC or Western media outlets that have incredible reach and power and can sculpt the narrative and streamline it across all the G7 NATO countries. So, so that really shows you what a threat the global English language channels are. And if you think a lot of them came online around 2007. You had Press TV, you had RTV, RT in Russia, as well as Telesur in South America. Indus News, there's one in Pakistan now. There's a number of countries, TRT in Turkey, that was launched recently. So the global English language is really powerful in terms of consensus building. So if the goal of the NATO countries, if they have a target in mind, Syria, again, perfect example, Iraq, Iran, other good examples, Yemen, if there's a target in mind, then they really rely on absolute monopoly of public perception of the narrative. If anything gets through to compete with that and gets any traction, it really makes it very difficult to create that consensus reality that's absolutely required. That is the object of propaganda, is to achieve a consensus. So, and the other thing I would comment on is social media as well. There was a window that opened up in the last 10 years where social media proliferated, and it allowed networks to build, it allowed news to travel. This could be used for a lot of different purposes, obviously, and not all good purposes as well, as we've seen with some conflicts. But in terms of deplatforming, these corporations are now getting more aggressive in terms of shutting down accounts. Press TV has YouTube channel brought down recently. So what that says is that that window, that opportunity that social media could somehow balance the scales in terms of the global conversation of opinion and consensus is now, that might be a factor that's kind of under threat. And ditto with global English language networks. So there's very little tolerance left, I think, especially from the Western position, for any dissent of whatever the party line is from a NATO perspective with regards to foreign policy, any major event. The Skripal poisoning in Britain was a perfect example, that there was a lot of talk at that point, really aggressive talk, of taking RT completely off the air because they couldn't They didn't want any competing narrative with regard to anybody questioning what the rapid response mechanism party line was. So, and we have broadcast regulators in some countries that do a lot of that job as well, in terms of regulating what they call disinformation now, which could really be anything. So then the last thing I'll probably want to comment on this side of things is that everyone does propaganda. Okay, there's no question about that. So I think it's important to understand that and to accept that, is that what's called public relations or propaganda. The term propaganda has it didn't always have a bad connotation to it about 80 or 90 years ago, but I think after the Second World War and during the Cold War, it became a term that had a bad connotation to it. So then it was kind of rebranded to public relations, and so, or foreign policy, public relations, foreign policy, the Council on Foreign Relations, and these sort of institutions sprung up after the Second World War. I think to be able to do that consensus building, but to kind of launder it in a kind of a nicer way, so it wasn't seen as being that brute force Stalinist type of propaganda. So, but what we have now is, I think, a return to those brutal days. I think this is the paradigm that we're coming into now. It's very tumultuous. These governments and corporations are getting very aggressive. So there is a major war right now taking place in the information space, and everybody is involved in this conflict. So it's very difficult to escape it, no matter who you are or what level you're participating in the information space.
Very much so. I think you definitely highlighted many points that have been echoed by several other independent journalists, as well as, I suppose, the general public, who I suppose, in the words of the book, manufacturing consent, whose consent hasn't been manufactured, so to speak. Whilst on that topic, I'd like to also just introduce our second panel speaker. KERRY McNAMARA is joining us from the United States. KERRY McNAMARA is a community college professor, and is also has been involved in the BDS movement since 2013, and is a professor at the Bossier Parish Community College since 2005. Thank you for joining us on our program today.
Thank you very much, HASAN, for having me. Am I coming through okay? I hear an echo.
Yeah, you're coming through just fine.
Great. Thank you. You just mentioned, HASAN, a moment ago in passing, the general public, and I'd like to kind of introduce myself as filling that role here today, and it's quite an honor to be on with Patrick and VANASSA and CAMILA. I've been following their work for a number of years, and perhaps I can add some maybe end product perspective to the discussion. Some of the things, a lot of the things that Patrick was just referring to in terms of the global reach and the kind of the fulfillment of Chomsky and Herman's work is reflective of what I had jotted down over the last week or so for notes, just kind of thinking things through and trying to anticipate some of the questions. So I'm happy to be here and can speak on several things. I've got some notes I've made, but Hassan, what would you like to do?
Yeah, feel free to speak on and comment on some of the discussion we've had here, as well as your own comment and expertise in the area. So feel free to express your views.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm a community college professor, not in the field of media studies or journalism or propaganda, as far as I know. Rather, I'm in the science department. I teach mainly chemistry and physics. And I've been there since 2005, and it was a while until things really started to fall into place for me as far as starting to discern what I was being told in the mainstream media and what the other available options were. back in 2012, 11 or 12, when the Syria crisis was just beginning to materialize, so to speak, I remember speaking to my class on climate change, and I was referring to the fact that so many of the rural population of Syria were being driven into the urban cities, and what kind of effect that might have not only on their economy but on their stability. And we just kind of kicked it around a little bit. We didn't put any political significance into it at the time, but it was soon after that that I ran across, maybe in doing some additional research on Syria, now I think a rather well-known video of Eva Bartlett speaking at the United Nations, I believe, at a side panel, these very points that we're talking about today. And she was really the first to call out her own reporters in the room for what they were feeding versus what she was seeing on the ground. And I think such an important and key tool of legitimacy when it comes to the messaging today is the fact that we have people like VANASSA and CAMILA and Eva and many more that are actually on the ground. I think that's so key, at least to provide, somewhat of an unfiltered and uncorporatized version of what's going on. So I've got many examples here of some things I've kind of been thinking about in terms of that. I thought I'd start by just kind of, I don't have the visuals that Patrick had, but if you picture a typical bell curve, and if you divide that bell curve up into, of course, the very large center, and we can kind of think of that as the mainstream media, or those of the population that are fed by the mainstream media. And then perhaps on the tail end, on the right, a very small sliver of the population that doesn't really follow is aware of the mainstream media messaging, but also, is more skeptical, let's say, and may search out alternative sources. And then on the other end, we've got really kind of the do-nothing party that really can't be bothered much by any of these issues that are going on and have been going on now for some time. So that's kind of how I divide up, and perhaps it's a very Americanized perspective, but from what I see here, from my small world in the United States, there's definitely the fat part of the bell curve is represented by the messaging of the mainstream media. I mean, you can try to fight around it and search for alternate sources, but it takes some work to do that. So my focus primarily has been on, and I don't want to monopolize any time here because I can speak to some of Patrick's points as well. As you mentioned, I've been active with the BDS movement, which is a very decentralized movement of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, spurred by the Palestinian Civil Society back in 2005, 2006, I believe. Very similar in messaging and very similar in end goal to the boycott movement that we saw. I'm old enough to remember the boycott movement towards South Africa in the late 80s and early 90s, and how successful that was. Along those lines, however, being a BDS supporter, okay, which again, if your audience isn't aware, it's essentially calling for a boycott. We'll just stick with the boycott for now. A boycott of any goods and services that are provided from the occupied Palestinian territories in what's known as Greater Israel, I suppose. But what you run up against very soon, and I'm sure most BDS supporters, if they're really into it, can speak to this, is a almost, and everything Patrick was saying is absolutely true from the U.S. Agency for Global Media and the Radio Free outlets, Voice of America. But when you get involved with the Israeli question, let's just say, you run up against a whole nother wall of propaganda. And there's a word that we don't really need to mention here necessarily for that type of propaganda that's so laser focused on that one issue.
Right, definitely that's something that is to consider, the different forms of propaganda that can be encountered when dealing with different governments or different causes, and the struggles that each whether it's a journalist or individuals go through, and the hurdles they face in dealing with each of those. Now, one interesting analogy that was mentioned by Professor was the bell curve. The idea that the most of it, the middle chunk of that bell curve is the mainstream media, and then you have either side, some of it those who are maybe slightly aware in his words, or so those who perhaps are just not interested at all. My question to you, Patrick, is regarding whether media is or can be objective with regards to that. Now, with so much of the media narrative as described through the bell curve analogy being dominated by the mainstream media, is that, number one, is it possible that therefore the media can be objective in that view? And as a result, since that they are the media ultimately who will dictate what is correct journalism, professional ethics, standards, and so on, would you say that they are really the ones to say that this is the correct standards, or who is to say what is? It's a very open-ended question.
This is a good question. So, you know, what is journalism today in 2021 is certainly defined very differently, much wider probably definition than it was 20 years ago, as an example. But, you know, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Times of London, the Guardian to a lesser extent, some of these in the English language sphere, these were called papers of record. So they were sort of the last stop, and sort of that's where history is written, or that you trusted that the level of, like you said, the standards of journalism were good enough, and the training was good, and the editorial policies were robust enough that whatever was printed would generally be true and accurate, and if they made a mistake, they would print a retraction, for instance, or they would run a counter narrative to balance off whatever position that was. So those were I think that was the old playbook in terms of mainstream press and journalism, and I think a lot of those old standards have gone by the wayside now. There's definitely a deterioration in terms of ethics, in terms of the robustness and having two sources, having three sources to validate story. That doesn't happen anymore, at least not in the United States, in the US media. Everything's about political expediency. It's about getting an impact. It's about winning that consensus. It's about winning that bell curve. The middle of the bell curve that he's talking about, it's also a moving window. So if you have to make something happen in terms of policy, or you have to move, you have to do an intervention, you have a window of time where you have to make that happen. So you have to win that, build that consensus, manufacture that consent of that middle of the bell curve at that moment in time. Because if you take too long, then the other conversations, those tertiary conversations on the fringes, are going to eat away. They're going to disintegrate that consensus in the middle of that bell curve that he was talking about. So timing is everything. So what's seen as consensus today might be totally undone by the facts in a year or two or three or four or 5 years. And what we have now is a juggernaut of the media acting as a machine, very much in concert with political forces, so the corporate media, to ram that narrative home. I call it brute force, because it really is brute force, and to do it in a timely fashion so that policies can be executed, so that the agenda can be gotten on track, and so it doesn't really matter in that sense what's true or what's accurate information. What matters is that it's good enough at that moment in order to execute policy.
Very much so. The shifting, as you mentioned, the political landscape and how it is a shifting bell curve. What may be that can be, I guess, acceptable as a political narrative today, it can change over time, as you mentioned. My question actually regarding the political narrative and foreign policy directive, my question to Professor Kerry, your involvement, of course, as you mentioned, for many years you've been involved in the BDS movement. My question to you is, how in America, obviously being in America yourself, how would, in your experience, the American media, how has it portrayed the BDS movement, and how has it used that movement to potentially discredit your work, for example, and how has it used that, I suppose, that fuel in the media to against the BDS movement to paint a particular image of it, and how has that affected your work?
Sure. I haven't been personally, that I know of, directly affected by any government response or political reaction to the BDS movement. Not me personally, but I know just in neighboring states. I'm in Louisiana. I know in neighboring states there's been, and I think a total now of at least 28 or 30 states have passed resolutions or law, in effect, codified the awarding of state contracts to individuals or corporate or private companies based upon their vow to not overtly or subtly even boycott Israel or make any motions in that direction. So that's the strongest reaction that I would really cite. As far as it being covered in the media, again, the mainstream media, which I don't subsist upon very much, I think if it were gaining any traction, large scale, then you would hear more about the BDS movement in the mainstream media. On the other hand, there's plenty of sources that I rely upon that make it a rallying flag, and it's the fact that it's had to have been legislated against in over 24 states to essentially outlaw, and in some cases, in some propositions, I think they failed, but to criminalize the support of BDS. That's the reaction that we get. So it's not quite as overt, but it has wide-reaching consequences if it's implemented. There's been a lot of pushback against it, thankfully. The case of another tremendous independent journalist who I follow, Abby Martin, she just recently won a case in Georgia where she was scheduled a couple of years ago, I think, maybe a little over a year ago, to give a talk. Not related to anything, I forget what it was related to, but it wasn't the Palestine question. But she was also asked to sign that, and she refused, and she actually won in court. And that Georgia law, at least with Georgia being quite a hotbed for laws recently, that law, I believe, was deemed unconstitutional.
That last example that you gave as well, about it obviously being declared in court as unconstitutional. Now, of course, it's well known to, I suppose, everyone that it does mention in the United States Constitution where it enshrines the freedom of speech and to express oneself. In your opinion, these laws which are being enacted, which are rather specifically targeting those who call for a boycott of Israel, do you feel that, number one, it's at complete contradiction with the basic amendments of the United States Constitution? And also, whilst you do mention that there is opposition to such laws coming into place, we had, of course, a discussion about manufacturing consent. How much effort do you think has been made to legitimize the banning of BDS, whereas otherwise someone may look at it and think, hey, it's a infringement of freedom of expression?
Sure. As a First Amendment throttling, it wouldn't be the first of its kind, nor would it be the First Amendment, really. Just in the past, dozen years or so, we've seen shots taken at the Fourth Amendment. What is it, the Sixth Amendment, I believe, that have really, the Fourth Amendment, of course, with the the intrusion and what Mr. Snowden has revealed for us. Your question, though, as far as specifically with BDS, Hassan, it's more, I believe, and I could be wrong about this, but I think the passage and the ease with which these that have been passed went through the state legislatures. We've never heard of any fight, any state house fight against its passage. I like to believe that they are more bark than bite. I'd like to believe that, and maybe Abby's case is some evidence in that direction. But they can have a chilling effect. Widespread awareness of BDS it's not widespread necessarily. So the passage of these laws seem to be preemptive, almost in anticipation of it gaining traction at some point. But I think the more it's brought into the light and the more people that are actually aware of these laws, I think the better. I mean, it's kind of an art of war. You're dealt a hand, and how are we gonna deal with it?
Very much so. I have a question just for you, Patrick, with regards to that. He mentioned, Professor mentioned the importance of the awareness of the general public of what's actually going on. And so, as you mentioned, manufacturing consent, if you can't get them to agree, you'd somehow portray in a way that they would say, why should I be against a certain policy? To what extent would you say that this method of manufacturing consent, in the words of yourself and Noam Chomsky, to what extent would greater awareness of the issues have an impact on public opinion towards countries which are obviously not in line, I suppose, with the United States government or other governments in which perhaps there is a negative opinion in the media, which you and others have mentioned are very distorted facts, such as, let's say, in the Middle East or other countries. To what extent do you think the public being more aware of perhaps the realities, so to speak, to what extent do you believe that that knowledge would have a direct impact on the ability of any government to carry out its foreign policy objectives?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I would say that is the case. I mean, the BDS being a really perfect example of the ability to boycott, or to, in a democratic country, that's definitely one of your fundamental rights, is to choose and to campaign for boycotts. This has always been traditionally the case, but most people don't know what's happening in Palestine, as an example, and that has to do directly with mainstream media coverage, because the issue's been reframed. And there's also a propaganda aspect with regards to the media coverage as well. And so they can't make any kind of objective assessment, most people. They don't have enough information. It's been wildly reframed in the media that Palestine is somehow the aggressor in that story. If you did an opinion poll in America, I'm sure it would come out, and people have, and it has come out that way. So there's no surprise when you would say that if a far-right Republican is saying that BDS is a terrorist organization, or that it's, quote, anti-Semitic or something like this, a lot of people would agree with that based on what they have heard in terms of the mainstream rhetoric in the U.S., and very little in terms of dissenting coverage or an opinion. Palestine's basically under a type of sanctions. It's under embargo. So there's other countries that are also under embargo as well. Yemen's under embargo. Syria is a good example as well. Sanctions against Syria. Most people don't have a problem with that in the West, because Syria has been framed as the aggressor or the villain or the enemy because of propaganda. So that is the consensus in the West. So when someone says, should we lift sanctions against Syria or Russia or Iran, most people would say, well, maybe, and many would say no. In America, the middle of that fat bell curve that Professor Kerry was talking about, they would definitely say no. They would say, well, we need to keep the pressure on Assad regime because they've done this, that, and the other. And so that just becomes de facto policy. That is a direct result of propaganda. because if there was balanced and objective media coverage and the facts were to be known widely by the public in general in the West and Europe and the U.S., then people would, there's no way that they would support embargoes and sanctions in those countries, especially if they saw the direct effects of those on the ground. Yemen is an absolutely perfect example of that right now.
Very much so. I think it's important to consider just how powerful public opinion can be in shaping a particular narrative, especially as you've alluded to earlier. If a country is supposed to claim to be a democratic country, it has to be one that goes by the will of the people, and so that it would make sense as a result that if public opinion was overwhelmingly in one other way, you know, any particular media would obviously struggle to perhaps portray a certain narrative. My final question for Professor Kerry, just to provide any other final remarks, for example, with regards to the discussion we've had, and also where you see the direction of this going. We've of course discussed the impact of mainstream media in portraying or pushing a certain narrative. We've also had, for example, laws which ban certain views or ideologies from being pushed. How do you see the future in terms of how allowing that alternate media space, allowing that freedom of views in the future playing out in the United States to ensure that different sides of the story are heard?
Sure. I hesitate to think in terms of black and white as the future, and the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. But it's either, you know, traction is gained in terms of recognizing this this program of propaganda, and I do have a few more points I can make afterwards if you'd like, or the propaganda machine wins. Now, what that looks like, I don't know if there's any end game to destabilizing sovereign states, which is really a lot of what I had the notes on in terms of the elections in those states. What we see, what we've seen just in the past, 3 weeks, I guess, is a Syrian election, an Iranian election this past weekend, one in Peru, and one coming up in Nicaragua, another target nation in the fall. Targeted nation, I should say. New sanctions being placed on the Ortega government all the time. So I don't know. I know which way I want to face Hasan. I want to continue to be a skeptic and not be afraid to be wrong. I could probably count on one hand how many times I've had to really, you know, discount some of the trusted sources that I rely upon that are on the ground reporting, like I said. On the other hand, it is worth at times just to take a tepid dive into the mainstream media, pick up on the messaging and how decontextualized it is, how banalized, I suppose it is, and how it can go in one ear and right out the other and not really even register, except to a trained ear, which knows what it's leaving out or what it's misconstruing. So I'm going to remain optimistic, I suppose, if not hopeful, that you know, and I hesitate to use the word awoken or woke because that's taken on a bad connotation as well. But the skeptics that remain among us, outlets like Patrick's and the work that VANASSA does, and of course CAMILA in Latin America, these are the outlets that they don't get a lot of publicity. They don't, and there's no reason they can't gain some traction. But otherwise, we're going to see just what Patrick, I think you referred to, or Hasan recently, with the just in the past 24 hours, the banning of Iranian and various other Middle Eastern television networks, seized by the U.S. government, the Treasury and the FBI, I believe, and they cited the U.S. law. So we can either stand up to this or we can be steamrolled.
Thank you so much, Professor Kerry, for your remarks. Definitely, we have to, as the journalists that all of you are, continue working towards what all of you believe in. I would like to bring on our next panel speaker. We've got a journalist from Latin America. CAMILA Escalante is a journalist and co-founder of the Kawsachun News based in Bolivia, known for her previous work at Telesur in Quito, Caracas, and Havana, and reports on social movements, socialism, the fight against imperialism, and more in Latin America, where she is currently based. CAMILA, thank you for joining us on our show. CAMILA, are you able to hear us? All right, we'll just wait very briefly while she comes. Do you have just any quick comments on anything that Professor Kerry said or anything else?
Yeah. I just wanted to just to expand on what he said. Yeah, I think it is. I think there is basis to be positive about. There has been a major shift in politics in general and political opinion on some of these issues. I mean, the issue of Palestine in America is very difficult to foresee how that has reclaimed a priority position among certain, especially young people in America. So I think this is also an extension of a generational change as well. So I think there's definitely a lot to be positive about. And also people are not trusting the legacy media. And I think there is a kind of inherent distrust, so there's more skepticism, more than a lot of people would expect from the younger generation. And so they crave authenticity.
Yeah.
And so this is something that they're also looking at mainstream media and saying, is this authentic? Is this legitimate? Or am I being gaslit here by one of the corporate media outlets? So it much more inquisitive and much more challenging in some cases than previous generations were with mainstream media.
Very much so. I think now we have CAMILA with us. Thank you, CAMILA, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. I really have enjoyed what I've heard so far from my co-panelists, specifically Patrick. It's been really good to hear from you, and it just kind of sounds like you've said a lot of what I would have wanted to say, and I would like to have my contribution be about the sort of coverage we do in the situation in Latin America and in the world with regards to coverage on Latin America. I don't know if you wanted to introduce a little bit of the work I did, but I'll go ahead and introduce my work. I co-founded an outlet based in Bolivia called Kawsachun News, and that was founded a year ago during the year-long coup dictatorship of Janine Áñez. This was out of necessity. It was something that we had wanted to do. We wanted to launch an outlet that revealed and exposed the truth about Latin America, several countries, not just Bolivia, but we wanted it to be based in a country like Bolivia that has such a rich and important history of resistance against colonialism, against imperialism, against the United States and the DEA and the agents of the CIA and the US State Department in the country, which has only wreaked havoc and worsened the issues that Bolivia has had with development and in terms of all different sorts of areas. So our focus has been on exposing and providing a platform for the realities in Latin America, based in Bolivia, but also covering countries that we've already discussed, like Venezuela, like Cuba, like Nicaragua, and other countries under attack, but also the realities of the peoples and social movements, the indigenous peoples, and grassroots working class people across Latin America and sometimes the Caribbean as well. And as you guys may know, today, just now, as this event was beginning, at the United Nations, there was a resolution passed, and it was titled, "The Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba." And this is about the 29th consecutive year that the United Nations General Assembly has voted by overwhelming majority in favor of this resolution to condemn the United States' unilateral coercive measures imposed on the people of Cuba and demand a lifting of the blockade. And 184 countries voted in favor of the lifting of the blockade. Only 2 countries voted against this resolution, and those 2 countries were the United States and Israel. This is applicable not only in this case, in which the peoples of the world and their governments in the international community, as represented in the United Nations, have demanded that the United States take their hands off Cuba. This is also the case in many scenarios where the peoples of the world, and specifically here in Latin America, make the same demands that are always against the interests of the United States and Israel and their allies. And this is something that we don't hear a whole lot about. What we hear is that the Cuban government deprives their citizenry of human rights, that there is a lack of freedoms, that press isn't able to work in Cuba. I've, of course, lived in Cuba and have been going to Cuba for a great part of my entire adult life, and have a lot of experience there. I know what the realities are, and our job as media that is, well, first of all, we are owned by a union, a campesino union of rural, low-income farmers, is to expose this reality, expose the reality that the peoples of the world and the people of Latin America specifically are against the general interest of the United States government and its outposts wherever it is. And this is something that, it applies to the situation of Palestine and Syria and the Middle East. The majority of people in Latin American countries have these same fundamental understandings of what those situations are, because we here have experienced years and decades of U.S. intervention. And so we are always in solidarity with the people across the world. But for some reason, our stories and that position that we take isn't allowed to be heard because of the propaganda war perpetuated by the United States and its agencies and its arms and the media. And that's why we call ourselves a propaganda outlet, because we are not only a crucial source of information, but we want to make sure that our information is heard and seen, and it's put out in the most general, basic, digestible way possible so that it's accessible for people. We're not doing tons of analysis, but we do provide analysis. We're not doing a lot of statistical analysis or in-depth reports, which are very important, like the ones that VANASSA has done. We are doing things that are a little more simplified because, quite frankly, we haven't had that justice given to us, provided to us, to have this sort of communication to the world in which we can tell the people what's going on to the international community in English from our perspective on the ground.
Thank you so much. CAMILA, you mentioned the efforts of the United States to intervene and interfere in the internal affairs of Latin America, and how, in your words, that has stifled or I guess got in the way of your ability to report to report what you want to report. What would you say has been the impact of, besides I guess just from the journalism point of view, but the impact of the intervention of American media outlets, or general mainstream media outlets on Latin America, on the narrative there, and what has been the impact in everyday society?
I think, as said earlier, it's very difficult to report on the realities of elections, electoral processes, and what people want for themselves, what kind of governments and states they envision for their societies. Because in the case of, if you want to receive news and information about what's going on in a country, for the majority of the cases throughout the world, you're going to be getting news from agencies like AFP, from agencies like Reuters and other big outlets such as the New York Times, the Guardian, and the Washington Post. And of course, the problem with that is that, you know, they have people who are supposed to be their correspondents or their point person based in the United States or based in London, or sometimes they do have a person who is based in places like Bogota or somewhere in Brazil, but they still are not reporting from the perspective of the working class or the grassroots. And this was precisely the problem just weeks ago and continues to be in the case of the Peruvian election, which just took place, where we see a partnership, an alliance between the right-wing oligarchy-owned media in Peru and the mainstream media throughout the world, which in large part echoes the same sentiments, the same views, and the same narratives on the situation in these countries, which is completely untrue. And this is the case, of course, when we're talking about Venezuela, which has faced countless coup and destabilization attempts since the Bolivarian Revolution, since the start of the Bolivarian Revolution, since Commander Hugo Chavez came to power. And of course, this has only increased under the current administration of the government of Nicolas Maduro, who is constantly under attack. And this is obviously the same that we're seeing in Nicaragua, as was mentioned earlier. And so it's, you know, these are huge barriers to helping people understand what's going on in the country if we can't even agree on very simple facts about who the people support, about who won the election. You know, leftist governments or progressive governments or anti-neoliberal, anti-US figures are not allowed to win, are not permitted to win elections in Latin America. That's just the fact. And if they do win, they're subject to intervention by the United States and the OAS specifically, the Organization of American States, who will come and cast doubt on the process or try to delegitimize the process before these electoral processes even begin. So this is just one of many instances. You know, another instance would just be the fact that social movements are cast as, or indigenous groups can be cast as terrorists, and that there's a connection that they try to forge in the media that is replicated over and over again, suggesting that there are, for example, ties that may or may not exist with other groups overseas, but trying to suggest that, you know, that these groups, regardless of what they are in some way, you know, terrorist groups, is just something that we're having to fight in the media day in and day out. And of course, the Trump administration left power this January, and 9 days before they left, they put Cuba on the list of states that sponsor terrorism, 9 days before leaving office. And this policy towards Latin America is being maintained and upheld and intensified and worsened under the Biden administration. So this is the kind of misinformation we're trying to fight. There's absolutely no way in which Cuba would support any type of terrorism. They, you know, just across the board categorically condemn all forms of terrorism. And so, you know, this is the ongoing project and task that we have.
Very much so. One more question. Of course, you mentioned examples of how you've described as interference in terms of elections or meddling with elections, or if there are governments which are unfavorable, so to speak, to the US, attempts to intervene there. What impact has that had, would you say, on the average person in terms of their livelihoods, in terms of their economies, given the level of instability that there is, and that a particular government is obviously evident from the work, unable to effectively plan for even a year or two without a possible threat of a coup or some form of destabilization attempt?
Yes, Latin America has had very turbulent political scenarios for many decades. Even in the case of Peru, once again, it had so many presidents just within what should have been the last presidential term. And, you know, in the case of Brazil, we saw a parliamentary military judicial coup against Dilma Rousseff in 2016. Then we saw lawfare against the former president Lula da Silva, who was going to run for election once again against Bolsonaro. He was not permitted from running. And so it makes it very difficult for people to elect the governments they want to elect. But why do people want to, elect these governments? People are fighting against neoliberalism. They're fighting against U.S. hegemony, and they're fighting against imperialism in general. These are the same exact, objectives in many ways, or similar objectives to the peoples across the global south, in the Middle East, in Africa and Asia, who are fighting against the exploitation of their peoples and uneven development. People want all of the same things that exist in the global north to exist here, a high standard of public education, a high standard of public health services, and people will do everything necessary, and that's why we're seeing social movements and peoples, indigenous peoples, different nationalities, is what the different indigenous groups like to call themselves, coming together and articulating in a more profound way with every passing year, which is of course more and more is seen as more and more of a threat to the United States, which is also seeing that peoples and leftist parties and governments here in Latin America are also building and strengthening ties and collaborative cooperation, mutually beneficial projects with countries like Iran, countries like China, and this is a huge threat to the U.S. So I think we're seeing is, what we are trying to do as an outlet is to try to, summarize this, to try to provide this information, allow people to gain a better understanding of what the processes are that are taking place here in the grassroots, among leftist parties, against among anti-imperialist forces, and the way in which people are trying to build a multipolar world by strengthening ties here in our region, including the Caribbean, but also overseas in places like Iran and Palestine.
Thank you, Camilla. I would like to just bring it back to Patrick as well, just to offer your comments as well on the points of analysis that Camilla has provided, and just your own thoughts on that as well.
No, I definitely would like to comment. I mean, watching the coup, the obvious coup in Bolivia, the ousting of Morales after what was a legitimate election was proven to be, but the way it was characterized, again, because of our Western media and propaganda, they gave a completely different picture. You have to remember, this is the same mainstream media organ that declared Juan Guaido president of Venezuela. I mean, so someone who clearly has no mandate in the country is then dubbed president and paraded in front of the U.S. government as the new president, and then recognized again through the rapid response mechanism. Everyone says, yes, he's our president as well, all of the NATO countries, all of the G7 countries, the European Union. So then the consensus is built that this is the legitimate leader. It's kind of outrageous when you think about it, but yet this is what's happened. So you have these parallel realities running. But what she said about the coverage of elections, I think, is really important. And this is where this conversation, and we can't talk about propaganda without talking about censorship, because they're two parts of the same thing. This actually transcends political partisan interests. It even transcends ideological, traditional left-right paradigm ideological interests. That in the last 6 months, Facebook and YouTube have prohibited any challenges or any criticism to the election result in the United States, the past presidential election. So anybody who brought up anything that challenges the election results, it's flagged as disinformation, and the content was removed. And YouTube employed thousands of people to carry this out. So within the United States, all the things that Camilla was describing that have been happening for years throughout Latin America and South America, all of those types of operations of suppressing the true public opinion, or manipulating media coverage, or just outright brutal censorship, this is happening within the US. But not only that, these social media platforms have the ubiquitous reach globally. So whatever they censor in the US is also censored globally at the same time, because everybody uses those platforms. And they have done the exact same thing to specific elections. So, I mean, as far as we know, Facebook has people who specialize in different regions, and that they will execute whatever the censorship or whatever the deplatforming policy is around any election in any country. So really it becomes an extension of the CIA, not to be flippant or exaggerate, but that's really what it comes down to, because these are things that have been done by intelligence agencies for decades, but now they don't have to. Everything's been nicely crowdsourced, and everybody has been honeypotted into these platforms, and then this is where the political conversation happens. So they have total control over this, as long as there are enough people, or the majority of people are on those platforms. So that is actually happening even within the U.S. So that, so is the lawfare as well. Lawfare, and it's not anything that's controlled by any particular government. There's a, what you might call a combine, a neoliberal combine that exists, that has lots of different interests, including government, corporate interests, elite interests, and I believe that they're also the drivers of these types of activities, and it's pretty phenomenal what's happened over the last couple of years.
Very much. So I wanted to bring that question actually to CAMILA. You mentioned a lot about foreign governments intervening or interfering, or in your words, delegitimizing election results and so on. But what has the impact of social media been in terms of suppressing opposition voices? In other words, media outlets such as yourself in airing their views and their opinions. What efforts have you seen that have been made to either discredit or to delegitimize or to quite literally suppress your views or the opinions of your fellow journalists when preaching a different view?
Exactly as Patrick said, we have, as anti-imperialist forces in Latin America, lots of outlets and politicians and social leaders, political leaders, have faced censorship across multiple social media platforms, specifically YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And this has made it very difficult to disseminate information that is outside of AFP and Reuters, quite frankly. That is truly how everybody gets their information, is through those two, and AP as well. So, we've had our, when I was at Telesur, we had our social media accounts censored, blocked, and, at the same time, some of the other secondary sources or other sources that people would normally refer to would also face numerous checks and blocks. President Nicolas Maduro, president of Venezuela himself, had his Facebook page taken down. May have been restored now, I'm not sure, but many high-level government officials of the Venezuelan have gotten their information taken down. And this is really, obviously it's a very big deal when any head of state were to get censored. It happened in the case of Trump. But in the case of Venezuela, because there's a complete absence of English, or a near complete absence of English language media reporting, it's very important for anyone who cares to go straight to the source itself. That would be the actual government and the government institutions, the government agencies of the Venezuelan state, and the president himself, because it's very unlikely that you're going to find all of this information readily available on, in article form and video form translated with subtitles, at least until ourselves and some other alternative media outlets came around. So we've had to, build ourselves platforms, because nobody is going to give us platforms. And if we were to be given some sort of a platform in terms of a position at a more mainstream outlet, we wouldn't be able to say the things that we're able to say currently right now, to be able to report on the different political situations throughout our continent. So it's been very, it's been very important that we build these outlets, these platforms from the ground up, with our own on-the-ground reporting, and it's only through social media that we've been able to do so. So, social media, of course, has been a double-edged sword in that in that regard, that we have, massive waves of disinformation and propaganda campaigns pitted against the popular movements of Latin America, in terms of what we call the Guarimba protests of Nicaragua. There are also Guarimba protests or Guarimba terrorists in Venezuela. But in Nicaragua, about this time, beginning in April, for a couple of months, there was a huge destabilization attempt against the elected government in Nicaragua, and a lot of the disinformation about that, and a lot of the calls for people to protest against the government came across through social media, through a lot of NGOs that receive funding from the CIA and from the State Department, indirectly through agencies like USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy. So just as much as they have used these social media platforms to spread disinformation and disseminate pro-US interest narratives, we have to also use these same platforms to be able to disseminate information, which sometimes takes the form of just basic translations or just subtitles of things that are in Spanish translated to English, so that people around the world can decide for themselves what's going on here.
Thank you so much, Camilla, for those for really amazing points, incredible points about the situation out there in Latin America, but as well the repercussions and so on across the region and the wider world. So thank you, Camilla, for joining us. We really appreciate you being on here with us today. I'd like to bring on our final panel speaker for today. We have the award-winning journalist and photographer, VANASSA, who is joining us on the ground, actually from Syria, if she is with us. Okay, I think she'll be joining us soon, hopefully in the next minute or so. But in the meantime, Patrick, I mean, any more comments about what she said? I mean, she did make some compelling points. I would say compelling arguments about the situation and how the situation can be dealt with or tackled or countered. What more do you have to add?
I think it's the key word I think that Camilla said there in that last segment was popular movements. And so when you're looking at this from a traditional political analytical point of view, you're probably going to miss this because people are so caught up in their parties or ideologies. And so I think the autoimmune reaction from this international corporatized neoliberal combine that does control the levers of media, does control deep state intelligence agencies traditionally. It's populist movements, whether they're right or Trumpism, whether it's left-wing popular social movements, whether it's Corbynism in the UK, whether it's Putin nationalism in Russia, there is this reaction against it. So it seems like populism in all of its shades, in all of its flavors, depending on whatever your preference is there, that is normally the target of this. So I'm seeing that as a repeating pattern. So that is very much a double-edged sword for a lot of people, because everybody does fall on different sides politically. But I will add, she also mentioned the National Endowment for Democracy, the NDI, National Democratic Institute, very active in creating opposition movements, as it were, in Myanmar, for instance, or around countries like this. This is now a new kind of front line on this in Thailand as well as a country. So there's this constant push and pull in those countries and so that is coming from those. There's other think tanks as well that are involved. The Oslo Freedom Forum is one of these hangouts for the global civil society. What I would say, some people would call them regime change incubation organizations, because they do a lot of that campaigning for regime change, specifically with regards to Syria. But yeah, those types of USAID and all these U.S. government and U.S. agencies funding these types of pro-democratic reform institutions. They're playing a massive role in Belarus as well in what people would regard as direct destabilization of the political situation there as well. So that's a big part of this conversation.
Very much so. I believe now we finally have with us our final panel speaker, VANASSA BEELEY. For those who don't know, is the award-winning independent journalist and photographer currently based in Syria. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and it was really interesting listening to all the guest speakers. Fascinating, especially CAMILA. I learned a lot about South America there.
Thank you for those kind words. Of course, we are delighted to have the panel speakers that we've had today, including yourself. Of course, yourself, you are based in Syria on the ground, and you are seeing the realities there. You've been, I'm sure you've observed many of the political events that have taken place, whether recently or previously, and also been reporting that and so on in the media. We would appreciate your initial comments or remarks or statement about the work you've been doing.
Yeah, I mean, I actually prepared a short talk, which I'll go through. I'll maybe cut pieces out of it because it's maybe a bit long. But I just wanted to really demonstrate how the media is working as part of the hybrid war complex in order to prepare war against a country or prepare public opinion to accept a war against a target nation, and how it then sustains that criminalization narrative of the target nation. And I think what's really important is to understand the role of the corporate media as an instrument of destabilization in the hands of the neo-colonialist cartel led by the UK, US, France, and Israel. And I think, first of all, we should look at the concept of hybrid warfare. This expression was invented by members of the US military command. Hybrid war is said to involve, according to the US military command, of course, a mix of conventional irregular terrorism and criminal means or activities deployed by a combination of state and non-state actors to include covert action, economic blackmail, which I would translate into sanctions or coercion, diplomatic duplicity, which is MO of the United States and its alliance, and of course, most importantly, media manipulation. Hybrid warfare is also referred to as multi-spectrum or full-spectrum warfare, which can be interpreted as a reference to the US Department of Defense document Joint Vision 2020, published in 2000, which has as its objective American full-spectrum dominance. My focus, of course, is going to be on Syria, but I think, first of all, what I would like to demonstrate, and I think this will apply to every single nation that is targeted by neocolonialism or globalism right now, are the 10 basic principles of war propaganda, which were laid out by historian and academic Anne Morelli in 2001. First of all, the aggressor nations claim they don't want war. The implication, of course, is that they want peace and they are only defending themselves against an existential threat from the prey nation, or they are defending the people of that nation against a tyrannical regime, which, of course, is the narrative that we're seeing playing out in Syria. Two, the adversary or target nation is solely responsible for this war and is threatening our moral values by their behavior or endangering humanity, freedom, and, of course, the myth of democracy. Our adversary's leader is inherently evil and demonic. Persuading the public to hate a group of people is difficult. It is more efficient to direct hatred towards the leader of an enemy nation. This leader will be criminalized and Hitlerized in order to enable the punishment ethic to be deployed. The aggressor, the US, the UK, and coalition member states, will portray themselves as pacifists, humanitarians forced into war by the inhumanity and intransigence of their enemy. The aggressor, the US coalition, is defending a noble cause. Of course, they don't have their regional interests or supremacist goals. The war is not to steal resources or to destabilize a nation for their benefit, but to defend human beings from, in quotes, a brutal dictator, as we have seen again in Syria. 5, the enemy is committing atrocities and war crimes. Atrocities and war crimes committed by the US coalition are negligible, or they are committed by mistake. And of course, this narrative is always backed up by the associated agencies like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the UN itself, and affiliated agencies. Of course, here we come to number 6. The enemy makes use of illegal weapons. In Iraq, we had weapons of mass destruction. In Syria, we have the chemical weapon narrative. 7, the aggressor suffers few losses. The enemy is mortally wounded. This is important to swing public opinion in favor of perpetual war. In other words, to blind them to the cost of these wars, to those publics in the US, in the UK, in the EU, etc. The aggressor will recruit artists, academics, historians, authors, social media teams to work on their behalf, presenting the mission as one that is recommended by and endorsed by these entities or individuals. The cause of the aggressor, the US, is sacred, presented as a divine mission, the Bush crusade against the axis of evil, the West's divine right to remove elected leaders from power because they do not comply with US, UK globalist agendas. And last but perhaps not least, whoever within the media dares challenge the aggressor's propaganda is considered a traitor and must be discredited. If you defend a target nation, you are immediately an enemy of democracy. And in the case of Syria, most famously, you become an Assadist. The corporate media complex is the interface between the state, intelligence agencies, the military-industrial complex, and the public. The media will largely follow the roadmap outlined by Morelli, ensuring the success of each element, in particular the demonization of the leader in the crosshairs, and the obfuscation of the underlying reasons for war. Intelligence operations will be covered up, and even when they become public knowledge, the state-aligned media will protect power from truth. We saw a very clear example of this in the recent document leak of UK Foreign Office documents, which exposed the vast extent of UK Foreign Office and intelligence agency interference both in Syria and in Lebanon, but most prominently in Syria, where billions were poured into a media project to provide PR and protectionism for the armed groups, which of course are dominated largely by Al-Qaeda and their affiliates, so a designated terrorist organization. And the UK Foreign Office was revealed to have been funding outreach agencies to provide PR and promotion for these groups, and to further criminalize, of course, the Syrian government and its allies. And this included some of those outreach agencies actually providing witnesses, fabricating testimony, which was then, let's say, published and used by organizations like the BBC, like CNN. Of course, prior to 2013, very similar events were going on, in the sense that the so-called citizen journalist complex, which was pushed into Syria by the US, the UK, and the EU, were providing reports onto a central platform. The CNN and Al Jazeera, Al Arabi were then taking their reports from censored versions of those reports, blocking out the bits that they didn't want you to see. In other words, the staging of those events. And actually, I produced a film with Rafik Latif, a Syrian documentary maker, showing and revealing those outtakes that were not obviously published by CNN and BBC and Channel 4, etc., but detailing the extent to which events were being fabricated prior to 2013, when, in my view, the entire media destabilization operation became a lot more sophisticated.
Thank you for that statement, Vanessa. You mentioned, of course, the ways in which, in terms of getting public approval, so to speak, for any conflict or war, different steps which can be taken in order to get that, such as portraying the aggressor actually as a victim and the victim as the aggressor, and so on. You yourself are on the ground in Syria. You've been, I'm sure you've been on the ground as well with the recent election going on, that took place, I should say. How would you say, from your observations as someone on the ground, how would you say was the coverage of that election with respect to this dynamic that you mentioned about the aggressor and the victim? How was that election portrayed, and how was that then seen in Syria?
Well, yeah, I mean, probably we expected the kind of coverage that we got. And of course, the minute that the election results came in, and we knew that President Assad had won a landslide victory, of course, the reports universally across Western media started to come out that the elections were rigged, that the ballots had been double counted, that large sections of Syrian society had been unable to vote. Now, of course, all of these reports are always made without any contextualization. The fact that civilians in the northwest are under the occupation of Al-Qaeda, as I said, as Brett McGurk said last year, it's the largest Al-Qaeda haven since 9/11. And the 3 million, the numbers vary, but let's say 3 million civilians that are living under the occupation of 100,000 plus armed groups, sponsored and financed, armed by the West and their allies, particularly Turkey in the northwest, were actually unable to vote because those US Contras made it impossible for them to do so. People were being penalized and punished for even suggesting a desire to go and vote for President Assad. Equally, of course, in the northeast, the oil-rich area of Syria, which is under the occupation of both the US and the US Contras, the Kurdish separatists that go by the name of the Syrian Democratic Forces, also made it very difficult for people in those areas to express their support for President Assad, or for any of the other candidates, for that matter, the other two candidates. So, you know, while they are saying that large sectors of Syrian society were unable to vote, they leave it there. So they leave the public assuming that somehow the Syrian government is preventing them voting for a viable opposition. Of course, this is lying by omission in reality. The other thing, of course, that they don't mention is in Turkey and in Germany, Syrians were prevented voting. In Lebanon, Syrians came under attack by US coalition allies. And in fact, one of the civilians was killed in those attacks. In Germany, Syrians that wanted to go and cast their vote were prevented doing so. And yet, of course, at the same time, the media will amplify the fact that the US coalition is seeking democracy and stability in Syria, while in reality, it's causing and manufacturing and engineering exactly the opposite. It's preventing a democratic process under Syrian constitutional rules, of course, which don't comply with the US version of democracy that they would like to see imposed upon Syria. And at the same time, NATO member states like Turkey and EU member states like Germany are preventing the democratic process. So the hypocrisy in the entire election reportage was as shameful as, of course, the entire media coverage of the Syria conflict since 2011.
Very interesting analysis of just the complexities around how it seems with the election and therefore its coverage around that. I wanted to bring Patrick into this as well. There's a lot to unpack, of course, from her opening statement, as well as her comments about the elections. What are your comments regarding, well, anything that she said in her statement, especially regarding the dynamic, the way in which that consent is manufactured, which you mentioned earlier, and which you mentioned in that sort of almost a chronological order, so to speak, as well as the way that a narrative tries to delegitimize, in this case, Syria. What are your comments about
I think the most obvious observation with Syria is that sticks out is the president has such a huge mandate, and if anybody who's followed that conflict closely from a factual point of view for the last decade would know that how much the Syrian people have gone through, how much the country has gone through into the attempt to hold the country together. So obviously the president has come out the other end of that as a national hero for many people. So it's not surprising he would have a massive mandate, as would President Putin in Russia, for instance, if he has withstood all of the sanctions over the years and the Russian economy is still performing incredibly well, better than expected, even despite having been under sanctions. Or you could say the same about the popularity of the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, who's been under embargo, or Fidel Castro for that matter. So you have this massive disconnect with regards to how audiences in the West are viewing these leaders and the situation, and that is again a direct result of the fact they've been propagandized, they've been gaslit, and you could go so far as to say they've been brainwashed over a period of time to view certain countries a certain way. A good example of this is NBC just did an interview with Vladimir Putin, the first one he's done with the US media in probably like 2 or 3 years. And they sat down, and the first question that came from the interviewer from NBC was, now we have intelligence that you are supplying Iran with a military satellite that will allow it to target military positions in different countries around the region. What do you say to this, Mr. Putin? Why are you doing this? So, and then of course the President Putin comes and says, this is absolutely fake news. Where did you get this information? And of course, other analysts are saying the same thing. So it's absolutely essential that whoever has control of these media outlets, the editorial positions, the senior producer level even, with regards to television, if you control that chain of those positions in major media outlets, you control the questions that are asked, you control how the issues are framed, and you can create a totally different picture than that which actually exists in reality. And so that's capturing those positions over the years. And I think there has been a concerted operation over the years to do that. And there's very much a stranglehold, especially in the US, I could say in the UK media as well, and in European media as well. Over the decades, I think that control has increased rather than decreased. So that trend is definitely moving in the wrong direction if you want to talk about free press, objective reporting, objective analysis. I think it's actually going in the other direction. You'd think that they would be more transparent now because people have more access to more information. But actually, I think it's going in, ironically, it's going in the other direction.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I have a question for Vanessa. Of course, you have been reporting on the ground in Syria, and as a result have also had an eye on other political events that have been going on in the Middle East, as someone who is, of course, based in the region. We also had another recent political event, which was the election that took place in Iran. You commented on the way that the Syrian elections were covered and perceived, and how certain members maybe were unable to vote. How from your view or analysis, so to speak, Did you see that play out in terms of the Iranian elections, which recently took place?
Well, I mean, it's fairly early to comment, of course, but I think what we're immediately seeing is President-elect Raisi described as a hardliner. And of course, the reason that he's being declared a hardliner by American media, and I'm sure EU and UK, I tend to see the entire media cartel as a homogenous entity. They will act independently with regards to domestic policy, but as regards foreign policy, you see them basically taking their lead from, of course, the three main central news agencies, Reuters, AFP, and AP. And you will see the majority of reports, particularly on what they would describe as adversary nations, as being literally copy-paste. So you will see them pretty much all running the same story with the same agenda at its root. And I think the fact that Raisi is already being described as a hardliner, why? Because this demonstrates a pivot away from potential reformist politicians in Iran that may have a greater link or a greater influence ability by the US towards the resistance. Of course, this has also been a result of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani under the Trump administration. And it's pushed Iranian public opinion, in my opinion, towards the resistance and towards what the US will call hardline resistance against imperialism, against US imperialism. And of course, Raisi is also being, in the US view, intransigent on the nuclear deal. He is basically saying that the US should adhere to the original 2015 deal. That, of course, the US, which will demonstrate time and time again, regardless of which administration is in charge, whether it's Obama, Trump, or Biden, it will demonstrate its dishonesty. It will demonstrate its tyranny in the sense that the Biden administration is refusing to even discuss compensation for Trump pulling out of the deal. And in fact, they are refusing to lift the sanctions, or if they do lift the sanctions, it's for a short period of time to ensure that Iran complies with their demands that don't adhere to the original agreement. So of course, Raisi is protecting his national interests, but that is not allowed by the US hegemony. So therefore, the press, the media, will immediately start to vilify Raisi in preparation for what they perceive as the combat to come. And I would also say that with Raisi reflecting resistance against imperialism, I believe there's a degree of desperation and fear from the US empire, from the imperialist bloc, because they are seeing, particularly since the Gaza retaliation against the Zionist entity, they are seeing a unification across all the sectarian divides that the US coalition has tried to manufacture, certainly for the last 10 years, but even before then, long before then, going back to Sykes-Picot, the Balfour Agreement, etc. They're seeing a unification of the resistance against the common enemy. And the election of Raisi is another reflection of that unification and that pivot towards resistance and the strengthening of resistance against US imperialism. And, you know, we're seeing with the shutting down of Iranian channels, again, that's another demonstration of this fear, the fear that the resistance is growing too strong, that public opinion is also pivoting towards support for the resistance, including Iran and Syria and Iraq and Lebanon and Palestine and Hezbollah, despite the US best efforts to declare many of these organizations terrorist organizations, you know, as part of their demonization campaign, which of course as I said, is supported by the media complex without any question, without any deviation from those narratives. It's extraordinary.
Very much so. The attempts have been made in different ways to in your words and in the words of Patrick as well, to delegitimize or to discredit the work of certain governments or countries, and almost portraying an almost inhumane face of them. One example of this, which you yourself have mentioned in many of your previous works and interviews, you mentioned the very often in the West the use of the white helmets as a source of evidence with regards to, as we've discussed as well, the chemical attacks that has been attributed to directly to the Syrian presidency. In your work as well as in the work of our panelists, they've discussed that that this perhaps that isn't the case, and that the white helmets is perhaps a vehicle for this, I suppose, disinformation, as you label it. To what extent do you believe, or to what extent, in your opinion, is it the case that the white helmets is a vehicle for pushing a Western narrative or against that of the Syrian government, or is it a legitimate organization?
It's certainly not a legitimate NGO, as it's funded by almost every state that has been involved in the destabilization campaign against Syria and the arming, equipping, and financing of the terrorist and extremist armed groups. It is an auxiliary of those armed groups. It moves with them wherever they relocate across Syria, wherever the new front line is. You don't find the white helmets right now in any area of Syria, except, of course, in Idlib, which is dominated by Al-Qaeda and controlled by groups under its command. There was a 2017 draft British government document which stated very clearly, I'll paraphrase it, that human rights groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and the British government relied almost entirely upon evidence and reports from the white helmets. And this is the wording from the report, to corroborate their foreign policy. So in other words, the white helmets, which are being paid millions by the US and the UK and other members of the EU and the US coalition of regime change, are tasked with providing the evidence to criminalize the Syrian government. But of course, this is where we hit this confirmation bias, in the sense that the white helmets are working hand in hand with Al-Qaeda and with other non-designated terrorist groups, but still committing atrocities against the Syrian people. And yet, although they are tasked ostensibly with documenting war crimes, they have never documented a single war crime committed by those armed groups, by Al-Qaeda, by ISIS, despite the fact that the British and American government claim to be fighting ISIS. Yet, according to the white helmets, they have never committed a single atrocity against the Syrian people, or they have not documented it. Instead, what they do is to document alleged crimes of the Syrian government and allies, which include the chemical weapons, the latest, of course, being the Duma attack in 2018, which has been discredited by inspectors belonging to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, who actually carried out the initial inspection at the site in Duma where the attack was had allegedly taken place. It has since been revealed by those inspectors and by their evidence that the final report by the OPCW was doctored, that their evidence that in reality there had not been any chemical attack at all, not even a chlorine attack, had been completely omitted from the report. Why? Because clearly the OPCW was influenced into providing a retrospective justification for the war crimes of the US, the UK, and France that bombed Syria without even having had a full investigation report from the OPCW. And so therefore, it has become clear that the White Helmets staged the hospital scenes. That must then raise questions about previous chemical attack claims and whether the White Helmets were also involved in the staging in Kawsachun and even in 2013 in Ghouta. And so when questions are raised, let's say, of this severity about a group that is providing, as proven by the documentation, by the British government documentation, is providing the evidence that will corroborate the criminalization of the Syrian government, then one has to raise the question, how much of the evidence that is being presented to the UN, that is being used to threaten legal proceedings against the Syrian presidency, how much of it is based upon spurious and staged events by groups like the White Helmets, because the White Helmets are not the only group operating inside terrorist-controlled areas. There are offshoots of the White Helmets now that are providing a similar service to the imperialist cabal. But the White Helmets, of course, are the primary source. Now we are seeing them starting to present narratives of the Russian and Syrian forces bombing hospitals in areas of Idlib that they are trying to liberate from that terrorist occupation. This is a familiar pattern that we've seen throughout all the liberation campaigns. The White Helmets are effectively the go-to source for the majority of the media complex. And they form part of that hybrid war complex, that entire soft power NGO complex that is being weaponized against Syria, probably in a way that I think is unprecedented. I mean, the investment, particularly by the British government, into these black ops against Syria, into these clandestine media operations to destabilize the country is extraordinary. I don't think we've ever seen it to this extent previously in history.
It's the points that Vanessa made about in her was hybrid warfare, different elements. It's not just about the physical combat, but irregular warfare, psychological, cyber, different aspects of warfare, which she has discussed. I wanted your thoughts about how she mentioned in many cases about reporting the facts, where very often it only stops at a certain point and the full story is not reported. And that is their way of saying, oh, but we are reporting the facts, but actually they've cut out a complete, the context is missing, ultimately. I would just like your comments on whatever she has said. If you go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I think what you just said there, what's been described as par for the course, specifically in war theater. Mm-hmm. Syria being just the most extraordinary operation, the most extraordinary multinational effort going into sculpting that narrative. The White Helmets, which Vanessa was describing there, they were really de facto stringers for people like CNN, for CBS in America, for the BBC, Channel 4. They're really acting as an extension, providing footage, edited footage, well-produced footage, beautifully shot. I mean, it had an air of Hollywood to it. And these were the Florence Nightingales in Idlib for this generation. I mean, it's an unbelievable narrative, and it played out so well in the West. And I think it went a long way to getting that consensus, manufacturing that consent in the West, especially for a certain demographic, people who are more human rights oriented, who believe in humanitarian issues. They gravitated and liked the White Helmets because it provided the story, it provided the narrative that they were so conditioned to accept, which is that's the underdog against the evil fascist regime and saving the children. I mean, it ticked all of the boxes, and it was beautiful, and so much money was pumped into that to make that happen. So, I mean, no one's ever seen anything like it before. We may never see anything like it in the future because it actually has been thoroughly exposed, although they're still going on with the production. It has been thoroughly exposed, and I think over time it will degrade its potency as a narrative. But it is an extraordinary operation, and it did hold the Western public opinion. It helped to hold the Western public opinion into position, and as Vanessa said, being used as evidence, believe it or not, in the UN setting. So that also goes to show you the low bar for forensic evidence in places like the United Nations, and that's been the case throughout the whole Syrian conflict. If you look at all their reports, it's the same thing.
Very much so. I'd like to bring it back to Vanessa to talk about, of course, Patrick mentioned the white helmets in the way that they are used and how it fits a certain, it touches a nerve, I guess, for those who say they're humanitarians and so on. I wanted to ask you about the relation between sanctions and the media. We have on the one hand the white helmets who portray themselves as the humanitarian godsend, so to speak, and they're trying to be there in the words of that media, to be there to help and to aid those who are suffering in Syria. And then on the other hand, we see in the media sanctions which are quite literally paraded by many presenters on many of the media channels. In your view, from your analysis on the ground, seeing the sanctions that have taken hold on Syria, would you say that the sanctions that have come into play, what role has the media had to play in the implementation and drumming up support for those sanctions, and the impact of those sanctions on public opinion of the suffering of the Syrian people?
Yeah, the media portrayal of sanctions, I think, is actually, for me, almost, and I didn't think I would ever hear myself say this, it's almost more criminal, and sanctions are almost more devastating for the Syrian people than the military war and the media whitewashing of the terrorist groups, as they euphemistically called them, rebels or democratic opposition. I particularly wanted to mention on this subject a recent report in Reuters, which was entitled "The Syrian Drought Puts Assad's Year of Wheat in Peril," which basically blames looming wheat shortages on climate change. And of course, the Syrian government corruption is always blamed or vilified in order to explain away some of the more devastating consequences of what I consider to be economic terrorism, particularly under the most barbaric Caesar sanctions, which came in under the Trump administration. But of course, Biden now is discussing the possibility of ramping up those sanctions. Unilateral coercive measures are actually illegal. Of course, we see this also in Yemen, where under UN Resolution 2216, 5 named individuals were originally placed under sanction. Of course, we know that since then, UN 2216 resolution has been exploited by the Saudi coalition, of which, of course, is aided and abetted by the imperialist cabal, the US, the UK, France, etc., Israel, UAE, has been exploited to universally sanction 23 million Yemeni people and to effectively besiege and blockade Yemen and plunge its people into a humanitarian catastrophe. Syria is not at that stage, but what we have to remember, and this is not something that the media is going to talk about, they will describe sanctions as necessary non-lethal measures. What, of course, they won't include in that description is the fact that the US is deliberately occupying Syrian resources, in particular the oil, and it is not because the US wants the oil, but because it wants to prevent the Syrian people having the oil. It also provides revenue for US Contras, whether it is ISIS or whether it's the Kurdish separatist forces. Al-Qaeda has an oil refinery monopoly, so it receives the contraband oil from effectively, indirectly, the US occupation forces. It then processes that oil and trades it inside Turkey. So effectively, all the terrorist or separatist groups or extremist groups inside Syria are benefiting from the US occupation of Syrian resources. The Syrian people are to be deprived of those resources. At the same time, and particularly coming back to this Reuters article where they talk about a year of wheat being in peril, and within the article they talk about the bread queues, they talk about the fact that the state is struggling to provide subsidized bread, as it has managed to do throughout the 10-year war. But what it doesn't mention is the fact that the Trump administration dropped thermal balloons onto wheat and barley crops in the northeast last year. And it doesn't mention that the Kurdish separatist forces are stealing and stockpiling the wheat, and that American vehicles are being filmed taking that wheat outside of Syria and selling it outside, rather than allowing, as I said, Damascus to receive that wheat. Turkey is effectively cutting off water supply to 2 million people in HASAN in the northeast. The northwest, where Al-Qaeda is in control, that means the occupation of the majority of the olive groves in Syria. Last year, we had mass fires in Syrian agricultural land and forestry. So we can't see sanctions in isolation. As I said, when we look at these hybrid wars, we have to look at every single aspect of it and how all of it is impacting on the people here. There are 90% of the population in Syria is living in abject poverty. I was talking just before I came on about the fact that until this year, I never saw children climbing into the big metal wheelie bins that they have here for the rubbish to take food to eat. You never saw that prior to maybe late last year. It started when the sanctions really started to bite. The media, if they report on these absolutely awful consequences of sanctions, they will report on it from the perspective that it's the fault of the Syrian government. It's the corruption in the Syrian government. It's the inability of the Syrian government to react. But of course, what they won't inform you that this is a government that has maintained stability in the country under its protection throughout a 10-year war waged against it by 140 nations, hundreds of thousands of foreign mercenaries poured in, well-equipped mercenaries. I mean, these are professional soldiers that are fighting against the Syrian Arab Army and allies here in Syria. They won't talk about the fact that the 2-day fuel queues that we see often here, people queuing for 2 days just to get 10 or 20 liters of fuel. Electricity being cut to the fact where in rural areas they're lucky to get 1 hour of electricity per day. Water shortages, bread shortages, as we talked about. They will talk about the bread queues. They will talk about that being the fault of the Syrian government. But they will never, ever describe to the Western public who is behind the absolutely sadistic collective punishment of the Syrian people and, of course, of the Yemeni people. You know, we shouldn't forget them either. We know that Iran and Russia and Latin American countries are also under sanctions, but Syria is in an unprecedented situation where it has survived 10 years of one of the most brutal and heavily financed wars to topple the government, which has demonstrated its popularity in recent elections when millions of Syrians poured onto the streets of Damascus and cities across the government-protected areas of Syria. And, you know, the stability that this government has provided for this country, whatever opinions Syrians have of the government, and there are people that oppose the government, but who recognize that without that government, without President Assad, they would not have survived these 10 years. And, you know, I can't describe the cruelty of economic sanctions, and they are never targeting named individuals, as of course they are always described. They are never described as unilateral sanctions, but that is effectively what they are, and they are designed to target and punish collectively the people of a target nation in order to turn them against the government, or in order to coerce them into complying with US objectives. Of course, the elections have demonstrated that the people, despite their misery, despite what they are suffering, have still come out and made the decision to resist, which has confounded the US. But sanctions and the media portrayal of sanctions is, for me, really, it's a war crime. And actually, I would go as far as to say the media is complicit not only in war crimes, the deliberate destruction of infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, essential infrastructure, the reduction in the ability of a health service to provide care, the lack of medicines. I have a friend who spent 24 hours in Damascus trying to find standard heart medicine for his father. It's unavailable. This is tantamount to genocide. It is tantamount to violation of the UN Charter, violation of every single humanitarian convention that exists. And the media, by not providing context, is complicit in the destruction of Syrian society and the murder of Syrian civilians through sanctions. Sanctions kill. There is no better way of saying it.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for many of those points. This is just highlighting the analysis that comes from the ground in Syria, not from someone who is sitting somewhere else, perhaps in an office in the UK or in America, but someone who is on the ground in Syria, giving ultimately a first-hand account of what we have. Thank you so much, Vanessa BEELEY, for joining us on our webinar today. It was a huge honor to have you on our program.
Thank you so much for inviting me to come on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'll just, if you're able to give your final remarks, your comments just on obviously what Vanessa has said, but I suppose bringing it all together if you can for us, please.
Sure. Just to follow up some of the points Vanessa made, this issue of sanctions is obviously, this is a big part of the conversation that's rarely had, because if you did an opinion poll in the West, and you asked people, you know, if you had to choose in foreign policy between your government waging war, military war, or sanctions, and frame that you have to choose one or the other. You can't say no to both. And that's how the issue is framed in the West. So of course, most people will look at sanctions as framed in their minds as the moral option, because it's bloodless and because it's not military. And so that's normally how it's portrayed in the media. And of course, what Vanessa described, what we also see in other countries, Iraq is a very good example as well of this during the 90s, and the blowback from sanctions in Iraq still exists today. It's not bloodless, it's not victimless, it's collective punishment, effectively. It's about maximum pressure. At least that part's, they're being more honest in the U.S. The last Secretary of State, maximum pressure campaign. So that's the problem. This is why sanctions are allowed as a policy. Until someone puts sanctions on the U.S. and puts an embargo on that country, I don't think the public opinion will change. The same with Europe. People just see it as an acceptable option if they generally support their government and what they say about Syria or what they say about the quote regime in Iran or something like this. The other thing is the Caesar sanctions in Syria, the Magnitsky sanctions. Both of those are based on absolute propaganda. If you deconstruct those stories, the Caesar files, this was laundered through Amnesty International and other international human rights organizations. The claims made in this are very, very dodgy and spurious, and a number of journalists have exposed that. The lack of forensic accountability in the so-called Caesar files. So there's a lot of questions surrounding it. Certainly you wouldn't want to name a piece of legislation after it, but that's what they've done because the narrative is fantastic. And it's got, again, a Hollywood type narrative. The same with the Magnitsky, the story of Sergei Magnitsky. Andrei Nekrasov, filmmaker, has made a brilliant documentary film called The Magnitsky Act that beautifully exposes the charade behind the narrative that the West have done to construct a whole regime up, literally calling it, they've named a whole genre of sanctions, Magnitsky type sanctions. You hear this all the time. And so that's built really on the back of a propaganda campaign that's got a lot of millions and millions of dollars pushing that. And so it's made its way into the Western lexicon, the Caesar sanctions, the Magnitsky sanctions. And on the back end of that, you'll see there's propaganda, sanctions on Iran. Iran's building a nuclear weapons arsenal. There's never any evidence shown about this, but yet this is seen as received wisdom in the West. That's the reason for sanctions on Iran. In Palestine's under embargo forever. Why? Because they're harboring terrorists or something like this. So everyone forgets the fact that the country is occupied. So again, so we see propaganda on the back end of all of these policies, not just the obvious ones, which is military conflict. So I think that's really important. That's actually the big sanctions are the big elephant in the room if you look globally. And you're probably going to see the same thing happening in Myanmar very soon. And there's probably a few other countries, the embargo in Yemen. Who knows what will happen in the Sahel region in Africa if a conflict breaks out in Sudan again, or the Central African Republic. You'll see the same type of program rolled out again as we've seen in these other countries. So, and again, this is propaganda based. This is propaganda. Every policy has propaganda holding it into position, and I think that's one of the things that's been proven very well. Cases have been made very clearly by all the contributors in this webinar today that that is actually the case. So that brings us back to this, to the core question. How is this propaganda being produced? How is it being disseminated? Why is it being disseminated? Who is disseminating it? Where do these ideas come from to begin with? And so that's where we should start our questions always when we're looking at media and when we're trying to interpret media in politics and policy.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for those closing remarks. Of course, we would like to thank all our contributors today for their analysis and their views that they expressed, giving their analysis from different regions, reporting from their regions on the ground, the everyday realities that they have seen and have been dealing with, and just in appreciation of the work that you have been doing. We just wanted to give you a small token of appreciation, just from us, just a mosaic piece, just for yourself, if you want to just.
Sure.
Yes. So this is just a small token of appreciation from us to you for the work that you've done, and of course for the time that you've given to today for all our dear viewers. Thank you so much. If you can just turn it, turn it around as well, just as well.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yes, thank you to everyone, to all our dear viewers for watching and taking part in today's webinar. We hope you are able to gain some insight, and maybe you may be left with more questions than answers. Maybe that's a good thing after all, in seeking an independent opinion. Remember to follow JSC Press on Facebook, facebook.com/JSC Press. JSC Press is an independent platform, so it's a platform for independent journalists. Thank you so much for watching today's webinar. Thank you and good night.